Welcome back to part 2 of lecture 6. The first part of this lecture we have devoted to a discussion of shareholders, the issues that arise, especially linked to this relationship between the shareholders and the managers of a firm. And today we're going to continue with the discussion on of the shareholders, a second very important stakeholder group if we consider the firm. So there are many different ethical issues that arise when we consider employees in the workplace. Think of fair wages, harassment, or using facilities of your company to your own advantage. And I'm sure that these are also issues that you might have come across if you have also worked at a company. You may have used the printing facilities to print something that was actually for private use, but of course there are many different and more serious issues that we will discuss today. It's not a novel topic, employee rights or employee issues, ethical issues that arise at the work floor, because if you consider the Industrial Revolution, the start of, let's say, the economy as we know it today, and the working of firms as we know it today, that was actually a time when workers were exploited and had very poor employee rights and working conditions. At that time, socialism and communism arose, and these were political ideologies that put the rights of employees back on the agenda of politicians. Of course, many of these issues have been solved nowadays, at least in many Western European countries, where we now have labor unions, we have employee rights, and there are many different agencies that also regulate and control the workplace. But still, there are issues that we can discuss, even though they may be linked to also novel technologies, etc. So that's something that we're going to look into today. So if you consider the contemporary workplace, there are some examples of ethical issues that link to employees that we can come up with. Think of the gig economy, modern day slavery, and artificial intelligence. And then you may also come up with issues like the rights of employees in the gig economy. Wages are low, rights are poorly defined, workers are oftentimes hired as self-employed rather than a proper employee. Well, what does that actually tell us about their position? And is their position justified if we compare the type of task they perform in comparison to other types of employees? Considering the second topic of modern day slavery, that is also a topic that you're going to discuss in the tutorial of this week. We're going to look into the case of modern day slavery and migration, and that of course links to the exploitation of contemporary workers. And we typically call that modern day slavery, as employees are working under slave-like conditions. Of course, in many Western European countries, examples of modern day slavery are much less than when we look at workers in developing countries, where there is a much larger share of workers that unfortunately face slave-like conditions. We can think of exploitation, very poor working conditions, people that have to work without a pay, or people who have to give their passport to their employer such that they cannot leave. Well, these will all be issues that we're going to also discuss in the tutorial of this week. And we can of course question whether this is ethical. And to give another example, the changing nature of technology also raises issues for employees or working in the workplace. Think of issues related to privacy, surveillance on the work floor, and of course, during the past 2 years, when we had the COVID pandemic and people were increasingly working at home, these were issues that received a lot of attention, right? Some employers started to monitor their employees at home, trying to see whether they were doing their job and not busy doing other things. Employers were afraid that employees would slack during work hours, and therefore they started to search for ways to control their workers even when they were at home. And you may of course wonder whether this is ethically just, whether privacy rights are violated, and whether there is some kind of regulation needed to regulate such practices. So we're going to take a step back in this lecture and have a look at the notion of employees as a stakeholder. So whereas shareholders own the firm, employees, you could say, constitute the firm. They are the firm. They act in name of the firm. They represent the firm in contact with other stakeholders. In a way, you could say that they are one of the most important resources that organizations have. And also for employees, we can talk about their rights and duties. We also did that for shareholders and management or managers, but we can also do that for employees and their employers. They possess both a range of rights and duties, and most often, not always, depending on the country that you're working in, they are regulated by law and embedded in a contract. Most employer-employee relationships are contractualized or contextualized by a contract that specifies your rights and your duties as an employer and employee. Most countries have a legal set of regulations that also shape this relationship. Think of a minimum wage, a maximum number of working hours, specific regulations about contracts, etc. And these safeguard the position of the employee as well as the position of the employer. And then you can, for example, think of the ability to lay off workers on the side of the employer versus the freedom of the employee to quit their job and look for another job. In a way, this relationship between the employer and the employee is also characterized by an information asymmetry, which can give rise to moral hazard. Employees may not act in the interest of the employer. They may do things during working hours for themselves rather than tasks for the employer. And this creates some kind of tension between the employer and the employee. We have laws to protect the worker, but still, we can say that there is still a lot of ethical issues that are linked to this relationship. And we're going to look into these issues today. Exploitation as one of the most, I think, sort of intuitive examples of when things go wrong between an employer and an employee also very much links to the categorical imperative of Kant, which is also mentioned on the slide. If you remember Kant, his version of the categorical imperative, the second version, if I'm correct, this version specified that people can never be treated merely as a means to an end. And this also holds for employees, right? A worker cannot be exploited as a means to making a profit. A worker has rights. They are autonomous human beings that have goals in themselves. And of course, if we want to sort of use this categorical imperative and maybe embed it in this relationship between employers and employees, we also need to think about their rights and duties, right? What rights do employees have and which duties do employees or employers have to safeguard the rights of the employee? So let's have a look at that. So there are various rights and duties that we can actually derive from this categorical imperative of Kant. The idea that employees can never be just treated as a means to an end, but should be treated as an end in themselves, right? People have goals, they are autonomous, they are dignified, they have a human dignity that should be respected also by the employer. So if we look a bit closer into the concept of rights and duties, we may say the following. So employee rights, they are entitlements, whereas obligations are duties. And this very closely links to the concept of human rights that we have also discussed in lecture 2. So many of the duties and rights have been institutionalized in the Western world, but not so much in other areas of the world. So if we have a look at the table where we list some of the employee rights, we can think of freedom of discrimination, privacy, due process, a healthy and safe working condition, fair wages, and some of these rights actually resemble more generally the concept of human rights, right? Freedom of discrimination, privacy, etc. Human rights, similar to employee rights, is a very westernized concept, right? So in many other areas of the world, you may not see that these rights and duties are realized. Some are covered by law, but coverage depends on the country that you're looking at. And the same holds for employee duties. So you may wonder, right, if we consider organizations that are working in different countries, that there will be a gray zone. Imagine a country whose whose headquarter is based in the Netherlands, but most of the production processes are located in India. There may be different standards as to employee rights and duties. Can we treat or should we treat Indian laborers the same as we treat our Dutch laborers? Or can we differentiate between those depending on the institutional framework of a country? In a response, some companies set up a global standard or a moral code of conduct that governs the treatment of workers. Right, so there are some standards that are more institutionalized if you think of working hours or safety. But still, and I'm sure that you also know examples of this if you remember the collapse of Rana Plaza a couple of years ago in India, where many workers were actually killed. Of course, the right of a healthy and safe working condition is not granted to these laborers. So there are issues, and this is also something that we'll discuss in the tutorials of this week. Well, it could be a very interesting point of discussion, right? So how does that work if companies' production chain is located in multiple countries with multiple labor standards? So we're now going to look into some of these employee rights into more detail, and I would like to start with workplace discrimination. I'm sure that most of you have an idea of what this means, but let me also very briefly define it, right? Employees who receive a preferential treatment on the grounds that are not directly related to their qualifications and performance in their job, that would be workplace discrimination. So discrimination really has to do with preferential treatment other than merit, right? Doing well or doing poorly. And indeed, if you think about merit, then you're talking about whether you are suited to do the job well. If you're suited, but still you're not promoted because you are a woman or because of your race, sexual orientation, disability, age, religion, nationality, then that implies that you're discriminated against, right? So any decision that is not based on merit, your qualifications and performance on the job could be an example of workplace discrimination. So in the last couple of years, maybe decades, there is much more interest in managing diversity as a response to counteract workplace discrimination. Right? So people are putting in effort to make sure that diversity is something that is safeguarded, that people are included at the workplace, and that there is equal opportunities for all, irrespective of your background. So that might also imply that the work base may become more diverse in terms of employee background because people start to select based on a diverse set of criteria. And that, of course, makes management of diversity also an important topic. And considering discrimination, this, of course, also includes examples of sexual and racial harassment, right? So people that are harassed at their workplace on the basis of some of these characteristics that are linked to diversity. And often, if you consider management programs that are prone or sort of linked to managing diversity, this also includes managing or let's say dealing with sexual and racial harassment on the work floor. So one of the most pronounced normative ethical theories that has something to say about workplace discrimination is the theory of John Rawls, the theory of justice. And if you remember, Rawls proposed that inequalities in the distribution in a society can actually exist as long as it meets two conditions. And one of these conditions, principles of justice, told us that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged in such a way that they are attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of equality of opportunity. And this last part is very important, as this describes that everybody should have an equal opportunity um, to get a certain position, right? To get a certain job or to get a certain, well, life path. And equality of opportunity, of course, excludes discrimination on the job at the job market, because if you are discriminated against, opportunities are not equal, right? Some people are then treated or excluded based on some characteristics that do not have anything to do with the job that they're going to perform. So from a theory of justice of John Rawls, this second principle of justice really strongly gives us an argument against work or job discrimination. So even though this diversity and discrimination are issues that increasingly receive attention in today's world, many organizations have diversity officers, also the university, their training programs to manage diversity and inclusion. We see that, at least in the Netherlands in 2020, there are still 67% of all the listed firms that do not have any women on their board of directors, even though there is actually a target installed by the government. Also, and that holds for many other countries, there is an earning gap between men and women. So for the same type of job, men, in comparison to women, earn 40% more than women in the same job. And even though this gap is narrowing, it's still quite striking that this gap exists. And I also found a nice picture on this that shows us that across countries, and the Netherlands is also in there, we indeed see that this earning gap, well, is quite persistent, right? Estonia is the country with the highest earning gap, where women earn 20% less than their male counterparts. But also in the Netherlands, 14% is actually above the EU average. So this is really an issue that, even though there's increasing attention for the issue linking to diversity, there is still a lot of work to do. And based on, well, John Rawls, his argument, you can, of course, I think, propose a convincing argument that this is not something that is just, right? For the same position, we have discrimination in terms of wages if we compare men to women. So what would you like, or what could you do if you want to deal with problems that are related to discrimination? What do organizations do? So there are, of course, many different steps that a company can undertake. Countries, of course, have anti-discrimination laws installed in their body of rules and regulations, but you can, of course, wonder whether that is sufficient, right? Many instances in which discrimination is something that is being discussed, people often flag that, well, it's a bit of a gray zone. It's difficult to prove that someone has been discriminated against. So these inequalities, we need to do something about it if we all agree that it's unjust, right? Tracing back to John Rawls, his argument. And there are two options that the book proposes, and I would also like to discuss them with you. Right, so you have equal opportunity programs which you can use to ensure procedural justice. And the idea here is that everybody has an equal opportunity to get the job. and that procedures are put in place to ensure that employees receive an equal and fair treatment. So you can, for example, think of a job ad that explicitly states that all people, well, different race, different background, different gender, etc., are welcome to apply. Or you can also think of a selection procedure for a job that is anonymous, so people do not know the name of the applicant. Right? So there are ways to ensure that procedural justice is made more fair. Another option that an employer has is to use affirmative action programs. And the idea here, and this goes actually further than equal opportunity, is that you target those groups that traditionally have been discriminated against. Right? So it's targeted at those who might be currently underrepresented at the workforce. And the idea is that this underrepresentation is the result of discrimination in the past. So you can do so by recruitment policies, right? Selecting or targeting these underrepresented groups, fair job criteria that might even be different from between the over and underrepresented groups. You might think of training programs for discriminated minorities, or to have different promotion criteria to senior positions for the underrepresented workforce. Right? So these are all programs to provide fairer conditions for discriminated groups, with the idea that they now have much more than an equal opportunity, right? This is sort of a compensation idea. And this is something that is not hypothetical, but really we can also see examples in the Netherlands, but also in many other countries, where people are seeking for ways to compensate this underrepresentation through affirmative action or even reverse discrimination programs, which I will discuss on the next slide. So here is an article that discusses quotas for appointing female executives, or also female professors appointed by the University of Groningen. And this also raises ethical issues, right? On the one hand, you might want to compensate underrepresented groups and make sure that they now have equal opportunities, or a bit more than equal opportunities. But it's also a bit of a gray line, because when does this turn into reverse discrimination? And with reverse discrimination, I mean that this is discrimination of the groups who used to benefit. So often in this sort of discourse, that would be the white male group. And the reverse discrimination is then used to promote the discriminated groups. And this goes further than affirmative action, right? Remember that affirmative action was used to sort of target these minority groups, but reverse discrimination actually really prefers certain minorities over others. So you can think of, for example, quotas for minority groups, which disadvantage the non-minority. There's a lot of criticism on issues or policies linked to reverse discrimination, as you also saw on the previous slide, right? People are debating whether quotas are really the way to go. Is that something that you want to install? Or is it maybe not fair to, well, for both groups, the minority and the non-minority group, to use reverse discrimination? But it can be also justified. So if you look at arguments from retributive justice, then often people would say that you need to pay for past injustices. So if you think about discrimination of women, then you would argue that men who have benefited in the past now have to pay for past injustices. But of course, you can also wonder, well, is the male white applicant responsible for this misconduct of his race or gender in the past? He was not really the one who was discriminating, but now he is paying the price. Another argument comes from distributive justice, and that would propose, or this sort of theory would propose, that rewards such as job and pay should be allocated fairly among all groups. So the idea is that some people that are now a CEO did not become CEO just because of merit, but perhaps because they were part of a social network, right? The old boys network idea. So therefore, fair outcomes should now be granted, right? So rewards such as job and pay should be allocated fairly among all groups and not just to people that are part of a certain social network. The question remains whether discrimination in any form, so also reverse discrimination, isn't ethically unjustified. So some people would argue that discrimination is wrong in any case, right? So procedural justice, safeguarding the procedures, ensuring that people have the equal opportunity to apply, would then be what you want to safeguard. And please also note that many countries, many European countries, even make very strong forms of reverse discrimination illegal. So it's even embodied in the law. Oh, and this is also just an example, right? So this battling of systemic racial inequalities, it's really something that, well, there is a lot of societal and political debate on this. Here is an example of lawyers that are trying to redress systemic racial inequalities. And this is very much this retributive justice argument, right? So to correct historic wrongs by now taking actions that reversely discriminated or discriminate the discriminated groups. Let's go to another right, right? So we've just discussed discrimination, workplace discrimination, and I would like to continue now to the right of privacy. And this is a very fundamental privacy, or a very fundamental right. The ability to control information about yourselves and the conditions for sharing such information with the organization. And this, well, right of employee privacy extends to 4 domains. We can talk about the physical domain, the social domain, the informational domain, and the psychological domain, where the physical domain, for example, deals with the right to your own space. So if you would be surveilled, this would go against the right in this domain. Social privacy deals with the choice to behave in your private life the way you choose, right? So your sexual choices or the way you structure your life, that's really none of your boss's business. And psychological privacy is the idea that you can think what you want, right? You're not compelled to share private thoughts or feelings. In the current age, informational privacy is increasingly at stake. This is a growing area of concern if you consider technological advantage, right? Our digital life is increasingly important and often also publicly is accessible. And this is not just a debate within the context of the firm, but of course it's much broader. It's a societal debate where we also see that there are new regulations being developed about data sharing, about privacy. And again, this also has repercussions for the work floor. Surveillance of employees are, of course, enabled through computers and artificial intelligence. You can monitor the time and pace of work, the usage of employee time for private reasons. And again, if we consider the lockdowns that we have had over the past 2 years, this really was an issue of debate, right? Can we surveil our employees when they're working at home? If we can, how far can that go? Can we access their emails? Can we account for their movements online, etc.? And also for you as students, I mean, this is also an issue that you have really experienced, right? With the surveillance of your exams at home. And also there was the same ethical dilemma between monitoring and maintaining the right to privacy. Data protection is of course important if we're talking about personal data that is stored or processed elsewhere. And there are also laws and regulations that protect data in general, but also data of employees. Right? But this is something that is sort of under construction. New technology often give rise to new ethical issues, and laws are then followed or following to sort of construct the boundaries of where things can go and cannot go. And of course, just two examples, right? Social media, data protection, how far can we go? What is the responsibility of social media in protecting our privacy? And a picture of workplace surveillance, right? Something that we have been discussing and experiencing ourselves over the past 2 years. How far can surveillance go? And how far can we sort of move without harming the right to privacy of employees? Let's go to the next right. The right to healthy and safe working conditions. So I started this lecture with sort of putting the concept or the discussion of employee rights into context, starting with the Industrial Revolution, where employees had very poor working conditions, had very poor rights, and of course now moving towards a much better situation. But still, there are some ethical issues that prevail. Healthy and safe working conditions, I would say that that really is a domain where we have been witnessing a huge progress. If you consider how people used to work during the Industrial Revolution, people died sometimes while working hours were long, people had to work multiple days during the week, did not have a weekend, etc., then we could of course say that, well, the standards of health and safety at the job have been improving tremendously. Nowadays, there are many regulations for health, safety, and environmental issues, so-called HSE regulation. And the main ethical issue that remains is the enforcement and implementation of regulation, right? It's not the fact, or the issue is not that we do not have these regulations, but the issue is much more whether we enforce and implement them. If you think about working at a construction site and you need to wear a safety helmet, well then often laborers, they feel safe at their job, or they think, well, I don't really need my helmet, so they won't wear it. And of course, that's really sort of the gray zone where we're talking about, right? So the employee might become a police in this sense, trying to surveil their employees and safeguard the health and safety standards, as she or he is responsible for the enforcement of the rules. So some jobs, even though health and safe working conditions have improved tremendously, some jobs still include a high risk to health and life. If you think about stunt persons, military workers, well, it's not workers, what you would say, but people working in the military, people working on an oil rig, right? There are a lot of jobs that are still very risky and provide a high risk to your health and your life. The principle of informed consent is very important in this respect. The idea is that no worker should be exposed to risks without precise information about what those risks actually are. And this implies that, given that the principle of informed consent is adhered to, everyone that takes a job knows the risks that she or he faces and makes a deliberate decision to face those risks, right? So it should be, if we consider this principle of informed consent, people should be aware of the risks of the job and based on those risks make an informed decision themselves. In that sense, employees are autonomous to make their own choices, right? And they should be able to freely decide whether they want to face the risks that the job brings. In the context of new technologies, these HSE regulation issues become increasingly relevant because you may come up with or maybe consider that new technologies are increasingly developed. Sometimes we do not really know the risks that a new technology brings. Right? So considering asbestos, which was used in many houses during, I think, the 60s and 70s in the Netherlands, that seemed at that time a super good product. It was very hard. It could be used in many, I think, rooftops. And people didn't really consider that actually the health risks of using this product were super high. People that have been working with asbestos tend to get cancer later on in their lives. And there are many other examples. So in the Netherlands, we had examples of the Dutch military where soldiers used a certain type of paint. And also, again, later on, many years later, it was established that the paint they used actually gave rise to serious health risks. So new technologies sometimes have long-term health consequences that we are at the time not known, that we do not know of. And in such instances, the principle of informed consent can only be partially applied because the consequences are potential or simply not known. So you cannot really consent with the full information that you have, as the information is sometimes not available. And this is where the precautionary principle comes in, which acknowledges the scientific uncertainty of processes. So sometimes you just do not know the consequences of a certain new technology. Let's continue to another type of right, and that is the right of a good work-life balance. So you might have heard during the news, may have experienced this yourself, that the pressure to work longer hours has grown. And this is something that we observe both in high-skilled professions as well as low-skilled workers. And especially in the latter category, right, so the low-paid workers in unskilled jobs, people are sometimes pressured to work long hours to fulfill their life standards. And such problems are even more pronounced in developing countries. But you might, of course, wonder, well, what is a healthy work-life balance? I would say that this is something that is subjective, right? It's something that only the individual can determine how to balance work and non-work related activities. Well, if we consider work-life balance, there's two particular issues that I would like to consider. And those are the issues of excessive work hours and the problem of presenteeism, and the issue linked to flexible working, part-time work, temporary work, etc. Let's start with the first. So the problem of excessive work hours implies that some jobs require employees to work more than their official working hours, so working longer than what you actually are required to do. And the chart also shows that this is something that is scattered across professions, right? So this is a snapshot of work hours by occupation, where the green bars are people working more than 40%, and the orange is more than 45 hours, 40 hours and 45 hours. And you see the share of workers within a certain profession. Well, you see that there are many different types of jobs that work excessive hours. So people in healthcare support, food preparation, office and administration support. So these are often medium to low skill jobs, but also in high skill jobs in the US, because this is based on the US context, you see that people work excessive amount of hours. So in legal and management professions, 30% of the workers work more than 45 hours a week. It's also these professions, they are prone to working excessive work hours. Well, I mean, you can of course propose that individuals are really free to decide this for themselves. Some people just like their job. So, of course, work-life balance, it's a subjective issue. But it can also be problematic that people start to feel responsible to show up at work even when they should be at home due to illness, or for example, because they are just free, right? You have time to relax outside of your working hours and you should not feel pressed to show up at work. Well, this phenomenon we call presenteeism, and it's something that is also linked to organizational culture, right? Especially in these very high-skilled jobs that we just saw in management or legal domains. Often people are rewarded by career profession or other rewards if they work excessive amount of hours. But of course, you should realize that this has an impact on physical and mental health. If you work an excessive amount of hours and you do not have any time to to relax, then physically and mentally this will have an impact on you. And we also see that, right, if we look at sort of burnout rates that have been growing in accordance with people starting to work more over the past decades. Another ethical issue that we could consider if we talk about work-life balance is the issue of changing work patterns, linking to more flexibility. A couple of decades ago, people often had a fixed contract, right? After a period in which you had a flexible contract or a short-term contract, it would be it would be changed into a fixed contract if you would be doing your job properly. Well, increasingly people are working in part-time jobs, are working temporary jobs, are self-employed or working from home. And this also changes the nature of work. On the one hand, you could of course argue that these arrangements can enhance opportunities for women, for example, or for people to work in a job where they don't have to live, right? They can work from home. But the major downside is that it also makes employees more vulnerable to exploitation. Often, the status of a flexible or a flex worker is less secure than those of the workers with a fixed contract. And this can lead to poorer working conditions. Maybe they don't have access to a computer or to a cell phone from their job, from their work, but it can also be much more much more striking examples that you can think of. Increased insecurity, right? Not knowing whether your contract will be extended. Lower pay. Often people in flex jobs are paid less than workers with a fixed contract doing the same type of job. And it could also imply that you're excluded from training and other employment benefits because you're considered as a different type of employee. Well, these issues are difficult to resolve, right? So from the individual's perspective, it's often difficult to demand better working conditions as they might be afraid that this will harm their career or their job security, especially when you consider that many other workers could do the job. So yeah, there is a discussion on, especially on this topic of flex workers. Poor working conditions. I guess that you all know the examples of Amazon warehouse workers that were not allowed to go to the bathroom if they wanted to keep their jobs. Or in the Netherlands, where we have delivery workers, where there was a huge discussion on sort of the status of these workers as employees or freelancers, and the employees even went to court and won the trial. So this really is an issue, right? So how do we sort of tackle, or how do we deal with the changing nature of the job, flex versus fixed? And what does this mean for the position of these employees? Do we treat them and do we grant them the same rights as a fixed or as an employee on a fixed contract? Or is it justified to give them other rights and maybe also other duties, right? So that's a question that is up for debate. Let's go to the next right, and that is the right, or it's not really a right, but it's a change, a development that is linked to rights. And let me explain what I mean here. So again, going back to the Industrial Revolution, we had this view of workers that were a resource, they were a cog in a wheel, they were production units, right? And you may have heard of examples in the Industrial Revolution that tasks were split across workers. So you would not just be building a table, but one person would be responsible for the legs of the table, another for the construction of the table, etc. So everybody would be executing a part of the production process. And this process of mass production, of course, yielded tremendous efficiencies and wealth, right? We could produce much more at a much lower cost. At the same time, this also dehumanized and de-skilled the workplace. People were not able anymore to produce a table, but people could only produce the legs of a table. At the same time, people also started to feel as if they really were just a cog in a wheel, right? They were not feeling as if their autonomy, their humanity was respected, and we call this dehumanization of the workplace. Remembering Kant's notion that employees are not just a means to an end, we could argue that employees, of course, have a right to participate. They have goals and ends which should be served. They have ideas, perhaps, about an organization. They have a stake in the organization. So employees should be granted to participate, and this could actually be beneficial for the organization as well. If employees are allowed to express their views and ideas, it will give them a sense of meaning. Right, so the notion of job enrichment, so rather than splitting up tasks, but again enriching a job, is something that increasingly receives attention to rehumanize the workplace. And you can do that by giving employees more control over a range of decisions, to give them a wider range of tasks, responsibilities, the opportunities to express views, and to give them a fair wage. And this, of course, goes against this trend of splitting up tasks that we have seen from the Industrial Revolution onwards, and tries to, again, encourage employees to participate. And this would be the right to participate in your organization, right? And ideally, the idea behind it is, of course, that employees, when they have the feeling that they can participate in their organization, are also happier employees and employees that work well, more efficient, etc. So in the end, it will also be beneficial for the organization itself. So I've been discussing various employee rights so far. The right, the absence of discrimination, the right to privacy, to a healthy work-life balance, etc. And now I would like to raise the question how universal these rights actually are. MNCs, multinational companies, are increasingly operating in different countries across the globe, often because it's cheaper to produce elsewhere, lower wages, lower production costs, maybe less regulations. Should we actually grant employees in other countries the same type of rights? How universal are these rights? So I would like to look at two sort of issues that are related to this question and discuss how this affects employee rights into more detail. So if we consider a multinational company that is working or operating in different countries, the question of culture, national culture, comes into play because cultures are different. They can be characterized by various dimensions. And these cultural dimensions in turn determine how people value things. So people's moral values are determined by their culture. And of course, if you consider values, that will also determine how people interact and how they perceive right and wrong. Within an organization, that is bound to play an important role, right? How do we view employee rights and how do we view employee duties is linked to the values that people have and the culture that people live in or work in. So cultures view employee rights differently. So you can use Hofstade's 6 dimensions to compare countries and their cultures to understand how people in different countries view employer-employee relationships and the employee rights that are linked to that. So for example, to give to illustrate how this would work, you may consider the dimension power distance, which determines how people deal with power differences in organizations. Some cultures score very low on this and are more likely to generate and accept equal distributions of power, whereas other countries that score high on this dimension would function the other way around. They will be more accepting of differences in hierarchy. And now just imagine that you are working for a multinational company that operates in countries with different scores on this dimension of power distance. The headquarter can be characterized by a low power distance culture, while subsidiaries are characterized by high power distance. And this may create tensions, right? Managers that are dealing with employees overseas need to understand how these employees view employee rights and morality, and how their culture plays a role in this. In the example, you might propose that the headquarter adapts their standards or their hierarchy to the countries that they are operating in, but some people might also claim that you need an absolute ethical principle that is applicable everywhere. So we can again differentiate between two different positions here, where on the one hand we would argue from an absolutist point of view that the ethical principles must be applicable everywhere, right? So an MNC operating in different countries should have the same set of principles to grant rights to employees, irrespective of your working in the Netherlands or in India. And a relative point of view would actually propose that standards can be different. So depending on the social and cultural context, the ethical view should be relative and adapted. So it could very much be that employee rights differ if we compare countries and companies operating in different cultures. So another option that you could take is that you use, as a general rule, human rights, right? The idea that humans have certain universal rights as a basic compass that everybody should be granted and everybody is entitled to these rights. You could propose that the same holds for employee rights, right? If you are an employee and you're working in a company, irrespective of the country you're working in, there are certain rights that you have just because you're an employee. And then we again go into the direction of an absolute view of sort of employee rights, because you would argue that, well, practices that violate human rights or employee rights, they're not ethically justifiable irrespective of the location, right? So some things are just not right. Exploitation, low wages, a poor work-life balance, etc. We could argue or could propose that these rights should be granted on the basis of being an employee or a human being to all workers and humans across the globe. So next to the question whether standards, ethical standards, should be adapted to the country you're operating in, you can of course also wonder whether MNCs should play a role in changing standards in those countries. Globalization has allowed corporations to have a broad range of choice of location, right? They can go anywhere depending on their preferences. And investors are bound to choose a company and a location with favorable conditions. Often, this implies that companies choose a location that has a low production cost, low levels of regulations, and social provisions, just because it's cheaper to produce products there. All these rules and regulations impose costs on a company, and therefore, lower rules and regulations are often attractive for companies. To attract companies to their countries, countries start to compete and lowering regulatory standards in order to, well, attract investments. And we call this the race to the bottom in environmental and social standards. Developing countries competing to attract foreign investments and lowering their levels of regulation and social provisions. And of course, this is a very contested issue. It raises questions how far the responsibility of an MNC goes. Are they responsible for the ethical standards outside of their home country? Well, some scholars would actually claim that multinational companies do have a responsibility to promote the standards in the countries where they are active. So in spite of the poor regulations with respect to environmental and social provisions, an MNC, once they start to produce or be active in a certain country, they are responsible, a duty is what they have to promote minimally just social and political institutions if they operate there. You can think of trade unions, health and safety standards, etc. as part of these provisions. And well, some scholars would also claim that this is linked to a duty to avoid harm. So as a corporation, you have the duty to ensure that harm is avoided. And you can do that by promoting, well, sort of a minimal set of social and political institutions in the country that you're operating in. So that was today's lecture. We started today with a discussion of shareholders, their rights and duties, especially in the context of the relationship between the owners of the firm, the shareholders, and management of the firm. We've been discussing the principal-agent relationship, and I've also proposed some solutions to this relationship. In part 2 of today's lecture, we looked into more detail into the position of the employees of an organization. What are their rights? What are their duties? And do their rights and duties change if we look at corporations that are multinational, so operating in different countries? Some of these issues will be discussed into more detail in your tutorial of this week, and we're going to do that using the case of migrant labor in Qatar. Building the stadium for the World Championship of Soccer, I'm not sure in which year, from the top of my head, there were a lot of ethical issues in the labor standards or the working conditions of the workers there. Differences between migrant and native workers were large, and people were exploited when working there. And that, of course, gives rise to different questions. Should employee rights and duties be the same for migrants and native workers? And what does this imply for their wages? So these will be questions that we're going to look into in the tutorials of this week, and maybe you can already take a head start and reflect upon them. To conclude this lecture, I want to challenge you to reflect on a final question, and that is the question, what is your responsibility as a consumer in cases like the one we're discussing this week? So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions about the material that was covered in today's lecture, feel free to shoot me an email or to discuss these questions with your tutorial teacher this week. Bye everyone.